On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union. 3 months later, nearly 32 million Ukrainians voted on the ruling in a national referendum. Over 90% of voters said yes to independence, with a majority in every single region, including Crimea. Countries around the world recognized Ukraine as a sovereign nation, including the newly established Russian Federation. But that superficial acceptance of Ukraine's independence didn't signify an end to Russia's centuries-long quest to subjugate its neighbor. 35 years later, Moscow is waging the largest war in Europe since World War II in an attempt to bring Ukraine back under its control. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv. This week, as Ukraine marks 35 years of independence, we'll examine the question of why Russia has never truly been able to accept it. The Soviet Union was propped up on increasingly shaky legs in the latter part of the 20th century, and cracks in the economic and political spheres were becoming increasingly visible from both inside and outside the Iron Curtain. In the mid-1980s, leader Mikhail Gorbachev tried to introduce reforms aimed at opening up the decaying Soviet system, but it was too late. The newfound openness, called glasnost, in combination with governmental restructuring efforts known as perestroika, contributed to the total collapse of the empire. During this period, national movements gained traction across the Soviet republics, from the Baltics to Central Asia. And as the second most populated Soviet republic, Ukraine's push for independence from Moscow was key in the Union's undoing. In July of 1990, the Ukrainian parliament adopted a declaration of state sovereignty, and later that same year, hundreds of students went on a hunger strike in what's now called Independence Square here in Kyiv. Known as the Revolution on Granite, these protests had several demands, among them the resignation of Soviet Ukraine's head of government, Vitaly Masol, and opposition to a new treaty that would have kept Ukraine inside a restructured iteration of the Soviet Union. After 2 weeks, Masol resigned and the strike concluded, but the debate around Ukraine's future as a Soviet state would continue into 1991. The following year, in August of 1991, die-hard members of the Communist Party in Moscow made a last-ditch effort to preserve the old, unreformed Soviet Union and launched a coup against Gorbachev. It only lasted a few days and was wholly unsuccessful. And then on August 24th that year, Ukraine's parliament adopted the Declaration of Independence. But let's look a little bit more closely at that referendum that followed that I mentioned in the introduction. Ukraine's Declaration of Independence might have been voted on by Parliament on August 24th, and that's why we celebrate Ukraine's Independence Day on this date, but it was the nationwide referendum 3 months later, in December 1991, that sealed Ukraine's fate. More than 84% of eligible Ukrainians turned out for the election, and of the nearly 32 million voters, more than 28 million, or over 90%, voiced support for an independent Ukrainian state. Now, if you look at Russian propaganda, you might get the idea that support for Ukraine's sovereignty was and remains geographically skewed. And that's why I want to be clear. In the December 1991 referendum, the majority of voters in every single region of Ukraine opted in favor of independence. In eastern Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, as well as other Russian-speaking majority regions like Kharkiv and Odessa, more than 80% voted in favor. Even in Crimea, it was still a clean win. So the idea that some parts of Ukraine were liberated from Moscow's control against the will of their constituents is demonstrably false. We're now joined by Ukrainian politician and activist Oleksandr Donii, who can share his memories of what happened in 1991.
I had been working towards August 24th for several years because I set it as my goal to fight for Ukraine's independence. Oddly enough, even back in school, I was preparing myself for prisons and labor camps. In 9th grade, I sat my mother down in the kitchen and said that I was going to enter Shevchenko University, but do get ready. First, our home will be searched, then I will be expelled from the university, and then I will be imprisoned. And when I entered Shevchenko University in 1988, I was expelled from the university for the Ukrainian cause. In 1990, we had a search at home, and in January 1991, I was put in a jail. So I considered that I had prepared my mother. That is why, for me, independence is not just one day, August 24th, but a path of struggle for independence, a conscious path chosen back in school, which was not easy, but extraordinarily interesting. The methods of this struggle included creating a student organization and holding a citywide all-student strike, something that had never happened before and never happened after us either. Meaning the only citywide all-student strike in Kyiv took place during the Student Revolution, on granite in October 1990. So for me, independence was essentially the final element in this years-long struggle. Ukrainians managed, under stateless condition, to create an idea that became attractive to the majority of the population. I wouldn't say this is entirely unique, because there were also the Latvians, the Estonians. There are a few examples in Europe, but the fact that it stands out from the general historical context of the European continent is beyond doubt. And the fact that we created this under the conditions of two empires is exceptional. They decided to create a single nation, and it succeeded. This is undoubtedly an exception. So, to a degree, Ukrainians, you can't talk about a dissident gene or a freedom gene, as that's an unscientific approach, but as an idiom you could say that here, ideas against central power in search of justice were constantly bubbling up. That is precisely why I continuously emphasize that for Ukrainians, a democratic system, for all its flaws, is optimal, and giving up on democracy is a blow to the gut for Ukrainians. Of course, like everyone, I rejoiced. But I warned that this was a huge challenge, and the struggle was not over. And not that we should just sit down, fold our hands, get drunk, and celebrate. No, it was simply one of the important days. What is more, for years and decades, I have emphasized that personally, if I were the one making the decision, I would celebrate Ukraine's Independence Day on December 1st, not August 24th. Well, because on December 1st, unlike August 24th, independence was confirmed by the choice of over 30 million citizens across all regions of Ukraine. In Sevastopol, in Luhansk, and in Simferopol. The majority of Ukraine's population that came to the polling stations affirmed that they were for an independent Ukraine.
Like I said, Russia formally accepted Ukraine's independence in 1991, along with the rest of the world. But very soon after, members of the Russian political establishment began questioning what that independence actually meant. And as would become a theme in the decades to come, the narrative around Crimea stood out. In January 1992, when the ink was still drying on the former Soviet republic's declarations of independence, Russian parliamentarians began challenging the legality of the 1954 transfer of jurisdiction over Crimea from Soviet Russia to Soviet Ukraine. The following year, the Russian parliament tried to claim that the Crimean port city of Sevastopol was a federal Russian city. Ukraine called the motion a violation of its territorial integrity and raised the alarm with the UN Security Council. And when Ukraine began negotiating the surrender of the enormous nuclear arsenal it had inherited from the Soviet Union, records show that Russia's attempts to rewrite 1991 borders loomed large among Ukraine's security concerns. In 1994, Russia joined the United States and the United Kingdom in signing the Budapest Memorandum, reaffirming commitments to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in relation to Ukraine giving up its Soviet-inherited nuclear weapons. The memorandum provided Ukraine security assurances in return for moving its warheads to Russian territory. And yet, those security assurances did not save Ukraine from Russia's invasion of Crimea 2 decades later, which, as you know, was shortly followed by the invasion of eastern Ukraine and ultimately the full-scale invasion of 2022. Whether Russia would have been so confident waging war against Ukraine had it not given up its nukes is debatable, but it certainly set the stage for it. And as we'll get into shortly, this marked a continuation of centuries of efforts by Russia to defang Ukraine and prevent it from asserting itself against creeping Russian control. The Kyiv Independent is your source for all things happening on the ground in Ukraine, the war, the resistance, and everything in between. And we're primarily funded by our community, who donate a small amount each month to help us keep the lights on, the camera running, and the news coming. If you'd like to get involved, visit the link in the description below. Thank you also to everyone who donates directly via YouTube. In order to fully understand why Russia has refused to accept Ukraine's sovereignty, we have to go back further than 1991, further even than the formation of the Soviet Union. Russia's quest to subjugate Ukraine has lasted through centuries and has seen multiple attempts by Russia to revise the origin stories of both countries. Both Ukraine and Russia trace important parts of their historical, cultural, and religious heritages to Kievan Rus, the medieval state governed from Kyiv that reached its height centuries before Moscow became a political metropolis. Kievan Rus would ultimately fragment in the 13th century, and the territories of modern Ukraine and Russia underwent very different trajectories, with a lot of what's now Ukrainian territory alternately falling under Lithuanian and Polish control amid attempts by Ukrainians to assert their own statehood. One example came with the Cossack Hetmanate, a semi-autonomous Ukrainian political entity established in the 17th century in rebellion against Polish rule. In 1654, its leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky signed an agreement with the Russian Tsardom based in Moscow, seeking backup in the fight against Poland. But over the following century, Moscow would increasingly restrict the Cossacks' autonomy and bring their institutions under Russian imperial control. And then by the late 1700s, Catherine the Great abolished the official political status of the Cossack state, in favor of absorption as another region of the Russian Empire. Modern iterations of the Russian state, from the Russian Empire to Soviet Russia, would incorporate the history of Kievan Rus into their national origin story, with the implication that Ukraine and Russia have always been two parts of a single empire. From the 18th century into the imperial era, the concept of the Russian nation was commonly depicted as consisting of three branches: Great Russians, aka Russia, Little Russians, which referred to Ukrainians, and White Russians, meaning Belarus. And then within this framework, the idea of a distinct Ukrainian nation was counter to Moscow's goals. If Ukrainians had their own language, divergent history, and self-governance, then they couldn't be Little Russians. Attempts by Ukrainians to maintain and promote an independent identity were met with persecution. At various times, Russia has treated the Ukrainian language, traditions, literary canon, and desire for statehood as threats worthy of censorship, political repression, and military force. In the late 19th century, Russian imperial authorities banned the publication and even reading of books in Ukrainian, while also suppressing the use of the Ukrainian language in public life and persecuting people for speaking their own native tongue. After the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, the Ukrainian People's Republic emerged from the revolution, before eventually losing the struggle for long-term independence as Bolshevik forces wrested control over much of Ukraine, turning it into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And under Soviet rule, Ukrainian language and culture was again gradually repressed in favor of Russification, hence why so many in Ukraine still speak Russian as their first language. In the 1930s, during Joseph Stalin's Great Purge, members of Ukraine's intelligentsia, including poets, writers, artists, and others who sought to preserve and promote Ukrainian culture and traditions, were systematically imprisoned, persecuted, and in many cases executed. And within the Soviet system, there was no real pathway for Ukraine to assert its right to self-governance until the 1991 collapse that I outlined in the first segment. So all of that is to say, 1991 wasn't the moment that the concept of the Ukrainian state was born into existence, but it is the point at which the living people of Ukraine permanently asserted their sovereignty. And the question of shared history becomes somewhat moot. One can acknowledge periods of convergence and divergence without drawing the conclusion that Russia's rule over Ukraine is inherent or immutable. We're now joined by renowned historian Serhii Plokhy, who can tell us a little bit more about how Ukraine functions in the Russian imperial narrative. My first question is incredibly broad. I know you've written multiple books about this very subject, but if you could summarize, what role does Ukraine play in this kind of Russian imperial narrative? What is the function of Ukraine in that narrative?
The current narrative that really underwrites the so-called special military operation, and now the largest war in the world in the 21st century, is that Ukraine didn't exist, Ukraine doesn't exist, Ukraine shouldn't exist. So the argument there is that Ukrainians are really Russians. The official line, Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, but that's the key argument. The history goes back to the really 15th century. That's the time when the predecessor of the Russian modern state was formed out of the empire that was crumbling and falling apart. And that empire was the former Mongol Empire and later Golden Horde, or to scholars it's known as Kipchak Horde as well. And the founding myth and founding mythology of the Russian state as it emerged in the second half, late 15th century, was that really the state had nothing to do with the Mongols. The state nothing had to do with the Mongol and Golden Horde, but the state, the roots of the state were really in Kyiv and in Byzantium, through Kyiv to Byzantium and then eventually to Rome. But deep down, Ukrainian story is very much the story of the 20th century and 21st century. That's the time when the empires fall and crumble. And most of the states that you can find today on the map of the world, or flags that you can find when you go in New York to the headquarters of the United Nations, this is really the result of the crumbling of empires and emerging of new states. And the world is going through the process of really re-educating itself and finding out that where there was once Ottoman Empire, there are all sorts of states from Turkey to Syria, after World War II, the emergence of Israel, and to a degree the same is true for the Russian Empire or for the Habsburg Empire or for the French and British Empire outside of Europe. So Ukraine is part of this really process that started 250 years ago with the revolt of the North American colonies against Britain, against the British Empire. Again, it took Americans for a while to reassert themselves as a separate nation. 36 years after Declaration of Independence, a special military operation conducted by British got to Washington and burned White House. That's just to point that the process of acquiring and then sustaining and defending independence is a long process, and so is the process of really presenting yourself to the world and redrawing the mental borders that exist in the perception of the world when it comes to the territories of the former empires. Ukraine is unique in one way. Ukraine is not particularly unique in another way, and is part of the really much broader processes, European but also global.
After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia maintained and advanced a huge degree of influence over the Ukrainian economy, media, and government. This took the form of trade deals, partnerships, and support for Russia-sympathetic parties in the Ukrainian government. But as they've done for centuries, Ukrainians pushed back against Moscow's creeping advances in an attempt to assert their own nationhood. In 2004, Russia openly backed then-Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine's presidential election. And when authorities named him the winner, international observers pointed out that the election had really failed to meet democratic standards, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians protested on the same Independence Square where students gathered in 1990. Known as the Orange Revolution, the movement forced a new round of voting, which Yanukovych lost. And then 9 years later, in late 2013, this pattern repeated on a much larger scale. Yanukovych, who had managed to win the presidency in 2010, abruptly canceled preparations for increased cooperation with the EU, which would pave the way for deeper ties with the West. Instead, he announced plans for a deeper bond with Moscow. And that decision triggered protests that would grow into the EuroMaidan Revolution, again taking place on Independence Square. After months of demonstrations and the killing of more than 100 protesters, most at the hands of Yanukovych's riot police, the disgraced pro-Russian leader was ousted and fled to Russia. So if the Orange Revolution demonstrated that the modern Ukrainian people had the tenacity to advocate for themselves, EuroMaidan showed that they were willing to fight and die for their freedom. And Russia's brutal response showed that they understood how strong resistance had grown. Immediately after Euromaidan, they launched a military annexation of Crimea and then an invasion of eastern Ukraine, where they would wage war for the better part of a decade before escalating to full-scale invasion of the entire country. Multiple observers have noted that Russia planned to defeat Ukraine's military forces within a matter of weeks in 2022, before then moving towards a process of occupation and annexation. And the strategy required swift removal of Ukraine's leadership, predicated on the belief that all political and social resistance would quickly collapse afterwards. But as you know, that didn't happen. Ukraine's leadership held its ground, the military mobilized, and the Ukrainian people have resisted every single day of the full-scale invasion. For years, Vladimir Putin, like others before him, has claimed that Ukrainian national identity is artificial, superficial, and easily punctured, and that Russians and Ukrainians are essentially one people separated by unfortunate circumstances and outside influences, namely, the influence of the meddling West. But if that were true, the Ukrainian people wouldn't be fighting tooth and nail against the invasion. They wouldn't be able to clearly articulate what they're fighting for. They wouldn't have evidence and artifacts of a long, rich history separate from the revisions and fabrications of Russian propaganda. Russia's dismissal of Ukrainian independence only works if Ukrainians dismiss it too, and that's something that they steadfastly refuse to do. Ukraine's independence doesn't depend on Russia accepting the historical legitimacy of a sovereign Ukrainian nation. It doesn't require Russia's understanding or permission. Since 1991, and for centuries before it, Ukraine has existed because Ukrainians know it to be real and are willing to fight for its future. It's been 35 years since the Declaration of Independence, and those decades have been marked by unimaginable sacrifice and tragedy. But for all its efforts, Russia has never managed to understand or destroy the Ukrainian identity, and never will. Happy Independence Day, and glory to Ukraine.
Hi, my name is Polina Morozyuk. I'm a reporter at Kyiv Independent, and one of our members asks, what are Ukrainian people's hopes for life after the war when Ukraine is occupation-free? What are they looking forward to doing, either on a personal level or as a group or society? Personally, I hope to visit deoccupied Ukraine and go on a road trip in the east, and also visit Crimea like I did when I was a child.
My name is Yulia Taradjuk. I am the Kyiv Independence reporter at the War Desk, and my personal dream is to visit all the places which usually appear in my reporting, and they are not accessible right now at the moment. So these are the cities and villages under Russian occupation and on the front lines. And also, I want Ukraine to join the European Union.
My name is Linda, and I am a junior investigative reporter at the Kyiv Independent. And my dream is for Ukrainian society to witness the special tribunal in The Hague, where Russian war criminals will be held accountable.
My name is Tim Zadorozhny. I'm a reporter at the Kyiv Independent's national desk. And my dream is to survive that all. And after the war, I want to see Ukraine's reconstruction. And I think it's going to be the moment where we could expect an economic boom. And I think it is an important point where Ukraine could establish itself as an important player in international relations.
That's all for this week. It's bittersweet to inform you that this will be my last episode of Ukraine This Week. But the Kyiv Independent will still be here to give you updates on the most important topics in Ukraine today, on YouTube, our website, and social media, which are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching. It has been my honor to be your host.